Hey, it's Rowan. In this video, I'm going to show you the process I went through in making this painting behind me of Stehekin Washington. But before we get into the techniques and how I like to build a painting, I want to show you a little clip of when my wife and I visited here this last summer and show you where I gained my inspiration. Check it out. We had so much fun down there. It was just really nice to get away and relax and unplug. There's no cell service down there. You can only get there by a boat or a plane or a hike in. As you can see, we took the boat, and at the end there, you can see which scene I was inspired to paint. So now let's get into the process of making this painting. So I always like to start with a little sketch on this toned paper just to nail down my composition. But I don't get married to this idea. It's just a guideline to get the painting started. Sometimes I'll go into a color study. On this painting, I went straight onto the canvas. I like to tone the canvas first instead of painting straight onto a bright white canvas. For me, it makes it easier to see what the colors are doing as I'm putting them down. On a bright white canvas, it can be a little distracting and blinding. So now I've got that composition down, just using burnt umber and a little titanium white in those lighter areas to see where my values are going to be. And I'm already seeing where I'm going to make some tweaks. Those mountains in the background are a little too high, so you can see here with my sky color, I'm going over the top of that mountain in the background. It was just sitting up a little too high. With this color, I'm using titanium white, ultramarine blue, and just a touch of burnt umber to bring a little more of that earth tone to it. Using that same sky tone now, I'm mixing in more ultramarine blue and a touch more burnt umber because you still want to keep that earthy tone. If you don't do that, if you don't add any burnt umber or burnt sienna to that color, it's going to look a little too electric blue and not look as real. I should mention that that underpainting is completely dry before I go over it with this color. I always mix in my color with a little bit of liquid original, and that typically dries overnight. So all this color is going on the night after I put that composition sketch down onto the canvas. So all those values get a little bit darker as the mountains come forward in a painting. You want to keep those mountains in the background a lot more muted to create that sense of depth. I'm staying really loose here at this stage. I'm not concerned with any sort of detail. I just want to get those main shapes that I see down, because if I want to make changes to an area, I don't want to have spent a lot of time on that area and then feel bad for going over it. These lighter greens were made by not using any green at all. It was actually yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and burnt umber. But these darker greens and these shadows of these trees was made using phthalo green, ultramarine blue, and burnt umber. I like to compare this first layer of a painting to building a foundation of a house. You can't build a house without first building the foundation. That's all there is for this first layer. Just those main base colors that I see underneath of all the other colors. Sort of like a foundation, like I said before, when you're building a house. That's how I build the painting. So I'll let that layer dry before I move on to my next layer. And typically with that liquid, the paint is dry overnight. It might have a little tack to it, to the touch. but you can usually paint right over it and you're not going to lift that paint underneath. So I might go over it the next night, or it could be a week from now because I have 3 kids and they finally went to bed and my wife and I want to watch Ozark or something and have a glass of wine. You know how it goes. But I'm going back over the clouds now using a color that's really similar to that distant mountain, but just slightly lighter. Now I want to brighten up those cloud edges, but still stay pretty wispy with it at this point. I'll add those crispy little details towards the end to really make the clouds pop. But for now, I just kind of want to add a little more form to the shape of the cloud. And here I'm taking a dry 1-inch mop brush and blending some of those bottom edges of the clouds where I want them to sort of fade away, but leaving most of the top edges with sort of a firm edge. So I found on that first layer I didn't like where the colors and the values were at on these mountains. So I've sort of lightened up the ones in the background and added just a little more color. And right now I'm adding a little too much darkness to that mountain on the right. You'll see me go back over that and brighten it up a little bit. But it's always just little tweaks. I never quite get it right on the first pass. Here you'll see me get out that palette knife to create some of them rocky details. Sometimes that's the best tool to create that textured look. And now here you'll see me doing this dragging motion to make the tippy tops of the trees, but I don't want to get in there and draw every single individual tree branch, just the suggestion of treetops. Here I'm using more titanium white and burnt umber in with that ultramarine blue mountain mix to create some suggestions of rocks and cliffs, but I want this more blended out than that side that I used the palette knife with, because this side has a little less light hitting it than the other side. Now I'm going back over this grassy area, making it a little more colorful, increasing that saturation a little bit, but still staying pretty loose with this. Now I want to make just a suggestion of trees, sort of like I did with those rocks and cliffs on the other side. To make that green, I'm adding titanium white and transparent yellow oxide to that blue color that the mountain is made up of right there. At this point in the painting, I'll allow myself to slow down a little bit and start adding some details. On this tree, you'll see me flicking the end of my brush. Again, I'm just sort of creating a suggestion of the edges of leaves, not drawing in individual leaves right now. And I'm using that same color to darken some of these shadows on these further trees. Now that second layer is done, some of that would be even a third layer, I would say. I went over it a couple of different times in some spots. But all of that is just intermediate detail. None of it I would call final detail yet. And in comparing the first layer to the foundation of a house, you could compare this last layer to the framing of a house and building that structure. That's all I'm trying to do, is just build that structure at that stage of the painting, but not adding all those final details yet. Oh, and if you've been paying close attention, you'll notice that I'm wearing a different shirt. That last shirt that you saw me wearing got some of that red wine spilled on it while we were watching Ozark. My dog came up, bumped my glass, got all over the front of it, so hopefully that'll wash out. Now let's get into some of that final detail. It's time to bust out that liner brush, and create some of these finer grasses. And sometimes, for making a mark like I am here on the branches of these trees, a really crappy old brush with frayed bristles works best. Sometimes an old brush makes the best mark. Back to the liner brush. This little dead tree, although it might be ugly, is kind of a focal point in my reference, right in the middle of the painting. So I felt like it had to stay in there. There's a lot of beauty surrounding this dead little tree. It seemed kind of ironic to me. It's time to make these clouds pop. This isn't pure titanium white. It's titanium white with a little yellow ochre for a little more vibrance. When I'm painting something like this tree, I'm not really worried about painting an individual leaf per se, but more fragmented strokes that look like individual leaves. And you can see I started to bring some of that background color through to just poke some holes through that tree. I didn't want the whole thing to be a mass of color. I want some of that background to show through. It makes it look more realistic. This lake was in much need of attention. Here I'm adding some contrast to these ripples on the left-hand side of the lake. There was a lot of time involved in making this grass, and if I showed you the whole process, it would be a lot like watching grass grow, so I'll save you from that experience. Here was an area that I wanted to adjust, so I'm just going over it with a liner brush, making myself little notes, and I'll end up going over all these lines, obviously. I felt like the composition just needed a little tweaking in this area. The lake is still just too flat. It needs more contrast, it needs more depth, so I'm adding more darkness to these ripples on the left-hand side. We're getting into the focal points of the painting now, and this river leading into the lake is how I want your eye to be led into the painting. This area was too bright, and it takes away from what that contrast of some bright highlights are going to do at the end. So I want to darken it up a little bit, add some darker ripples. This is basically pure titanium white. Just doing little sideways scrapes with this palette knife, adding little bits of paint for wave highlights. I also do little highlights with a liner brush. Sometimes it's better with a palette knife, sometimes I like it to have a nice straight little line. It all depends on what night I'm working on it, how I feel, what kind of mark I think is working best. Just adding a little more contrast to that left-hand side to darken it up a little bit to lead your eye into the middle of the painting. And to top it all off, I'm using my maul stick to create some shadow lines of where I want sun rays to come into the painting. Well, I hope you liked this video, and I hope you were entertained by watching the process. And I really mostly hope I didn't just bore you to tears. So if you liked this video, go ahead and like it and subscribe, because I'm planning on making more videos just like this. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later.